The alleged blocking of Vladimir Putin's flight route to Alaska by NATO forces has sparked a wave of speculation, tension, and intrigue across diplomatic, military, and public spheres. The incident, if true, reflects a growing boldness in NATO's posture against Russia, particularly at a time when global geopolitical fault lines are deepening. This scenario reportedly unfolded just days before a significant meeting that was expected to involve high-stakes discussions on security, trade, and Arctic navigation rights. The claim is that NATO airspace restrictions, combined with specific flight clearance denials from certain member states, have forced Moscow to consider alternative routes for the Russian president's official journey. Such an occurrence is rare, as heads of state generally enjoy secured diplomatic passage agreements. But the current climate of distrust seems to have shifted the unwritten rules of international air travel. The backdrop to this is a tense geopolitical chessboard. Russia's increased military presence in the Arctic, its growing partnerships with countries adversarial to the West, and its ongoing standoff in Ukraine have all led NATO allies to adopt a far more assertive posture. Blocking or rerouting a presidential flight is more than a logistical issue. It is a symbolic message of resistance, a way of underlining that Russia's influence cannot go unchecked even in the domain of presidential protocol. This action, if coordinated, would be seen as a collective statement by NATO members that Russia's aggressive moves in various regions have consequences, even at the highest diplomatic levels. The diplomatic fallout from such a move could be severe, as Russia is likely to view it as both a humiliation and a provocation, potentially leading to a tit-for-tat escalation in restrictions against Western leaders or diplomats. From a military logistics perspective, the denial of certain air corridors over NATO-controlled territories would compel Russia's presidential aircraft to adopt longer, less direct routes to reach Alaska. This could involve flying through non-NATO countries' airspace, possibly adding hours to the journey, increasing fuel requirements, and forcing Russian air security teams to adapt to unfamiliar territory. In aviation terms, route planning for a presidential flight is already a highly complex endeavor involving coordination with multiple nations, intelligence assessments, and security precautions. Introducing deliberate obstructions into this process raises both the difficulty and the risks. For instance, avoiding NATO-controlled skies might require passage over countries with which Russia has more tenuous relations, where the security of the airspace is less predictable and radar monitoring may not be as cooperative. Such a maneuver could be defended by NATO allies under the argument of sovereign right to control airspace, and the need to uphold security protocols amid tensions with Russia. Officially, member states can deny overflight requests for state aircraft, especially in cases where they claim security risks or ongoing conflicts that justify the decision. However, in practice, these denials are rare for heads of state, because they risk being interpreted as direct acts of hostility. The current tension suggests that NATO leaders may be willing to absorb the diplomatic cost in exchange for sending a pointed message to Moscow. This could also serve as a demonstration of unity among NATO members, signaling that the alliance is aligned in its readiness to counter Russian assertiveness in every possible domain. For Russia, the optics of this situation are particularly sensitive. Putin's leadership has long been characterized by projecting strength, control, and defiance in the face of Western opposition. Any perceived restriction on his movements undermines that image, both domestically and internationally. Russian state media would be tasked with carefully framing the incident either by downplaying it, portraying NATO's actions as an act of cowardice, or reframing it as a calculated Western attempt to obstruct Russia's diplomatic mission. Within Russia, such a move by NATO could be spun into a rallying point, reinforcing narratives of Western encirclement and justifying further military and political measures. Conversely, if the Kremlin feels cornered, it may escalate in other areas, such as airspace denials to European leaders, restrictions on NATO-linked diplomatic missions, or heightened military patrols in contested regions. Another layer of complexity is the location in question: Alaska. Situated strategically across from Russia's Far East, Alaska holds both symbolic and military significance in the broader U.S.-Russia dynamic. Any visit by the Russian president to this region is bound to be viewed under the lens of both Arctic strategy and bilateral relations with the United States. The Arctic itself has become a rapidly militarizing zone. With both Russia and NATO increasing their icebreaker fleets, surveillance operations, and territorial claims. Blocking Putin's route to Alaska could thus be interpreted as part of a wider Arctic containment policy, ensuring that Russia's presence in that theater remains under constant pressure. If NATO's move was intended as a deterrent, it ties directly into the broader contest for control over northern sea lanes, resource-rich zones, and strategic military positioning. From a legal standpoint, international aviation is governed by conventions like the Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation, which generally separates civil and state aircraft in terms of rules. State aircraft, including those carrying heads of state, operate under a different set of arrangements that require prior diplomatic clearance for overflight. This clearance is at the discretion of the nation controlling the airspace. Therefore, if NATO member states chose to refuse clearance for the Russian president's flight, they would be acting within their rights under international law, though doing so in such a high-profile case would be highly unusual and provocative. The decision-making process for such a denial would involve the highest levels of government, intelligence agencies, and possibly military advisories, weighing both the strategic gains and the risks of escalation. Meanwhile, analysts point to the timing of the alleged blockade as especially significant. With global attention focused on upcoming meetings between world leaders, any impediment to Putin's travel could alter the diplomatic dynamics of those gatherings. If Putin's participation in certain talks is delayed or complicated, NATO may gain leverage by disrupting Russia's planned diplomatic agenda. However, this also risks backfiring, as Russia could use the incident as proof that the West is obstructing dialogue and peace efforts. In the court of global opinion, how each side frames the narrative could influence neutral or non-aligned states, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where leaders are watching the unfolding tensions closely. There is also speculation about whether the move was pre-planned as a strategic warning or a reactive decision based on recent intelligence. If NATO acted on new information suggesting security threats or possible incidents tied to the flight, the decision could be framed as a protective measure rather than a political statement. Yet, given the public nature of such a denial, it is almost impossible to separate the security justifications from the political implications. In international relations, perception often matters more than intent, and in this case, the perception is one of open defiance of Russia's head of state. Within Russia's political and military circles, the incident could trigger calls for reciprocal measures. This might include tightening airspace over critical Russian-controlled regions, limiting NATO reconnaissance flights near Russian borders, or imposing overflight restrictions on certain Western leaders traveling to Asia. While these responses would not necessarily match the symbolism of blocking a presidential route, they would add friction to NATO's logistical and diplomatic operations. The potential for escalation exists, not just in the air, but also in other domains where Russia and NATO intersect, including cyber operations, maritime patrols, and influence campaigns in contested regions.